I think we should start. Yes, welcome to our studio in Frankfurt and our second digital keynote event. My name is Christine Pogge. I'm from PODIUM Redner, or in English, PODIUM Speaker Bureaus, PODIUM Speaker Agency. And I'm so pleased about your interest in this format, which we have created together with our partner, Cyber Insights. It's the second time we will meet you here for an international PODIUM meets Cyber Insight talk today. And yes, dear guests, whether we are talking about pandemic, climate crisis, or the war in Ukraine and its consequences, the major challenges facing politics, the economy, society, and us as people are global. And they can only be solved by working together. That's why I'm very, very happy and very pleased that we have two experts speaking today who will provide us with important background knowledge to gain a deeper understanding in the current situations and also keep eye on future risks we could have in the future. Yes. I will now hand over to Nutza Jamishvili from Cyber Insights, because I'm sure she also would like to welcome you, and she will moderate the Q&A session after the keynotes today. Dear Nutza, I hereby hand it over to you.
Thank you, Christine. Hello, everyone. I'm Nutza Jamishvili, in charge of expert relations at Cyber Insights. And I'm excited to welcome you to our second collaboration talk series with PODIUM and Cyber Insights. Our first joint webinar was held just a couple months ago with Dr. Henning Beck on the brain versus artificial intelligence, new ideas in a digital world. Please make sure to check our YouTube channel to see the full version there. I want to give a brief overview about our company and what we do. Cyber Insights has extensively worked with PODIUM for the past couple of years and has built a close partnership. At Cyber Insights, we combine human and artificial intelligence to deliver unique keynote speakers and moderators to our clients' corporate events. We are working with leading banks, multinational corporations, event management companies across the globe. And the work we do is bespoke. So this means that we go to the market to find very impressive speakers that are perfectly matched with the DNA of our clients' events. So let's get started with today's topic, navigating geopolitics and cybersecurity. And I would like to present our first speaker, Ambassador Giorgi Badridze, who has around 3 decades of experience in the public and diplomatic sector. He is a senior fellow at the Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Studies. He is also a professor and the former ambassador of Georgia to the United Kingdom and Ireland. Mr. Badridze will be talking about Russia-Ukraine war, its global implications, Western approach, and more. I would like to remind our audience to write down their questions to Q&A box at the bottom of their screens, and we will be asking those questions to our speakers at the end of their presentations. Mr. Badridze, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nutza. Thank you, Cyber Insights and PODIUM for having me. We live in really fascinating times. Before our eyes, the Europe as we knew it is changing. The whole world has been affected by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and its implications are, well, there's more to come. So I'll try to speak about this war, its implications, to understand why Putin did it and what further implications will be in short and medium term. For that, we need to understand what motivated Putin and how the international reaction, or the lack of it, to Russia's previous assaults on the rules-based international order had made the current conflict possible. In my short presentation, I will try to analyze Russia's political system as the core driver of its aggressive foreign policy and highlight the contradictions between the actions of the regime and Russia's long-term national interests. I will also briefly discuss the patterns of the Western approaches to Russia, which were often based on misunderstanding of the latter's goals and modus operandi. I will conclude with the overview of the current situation on the front lines of Ukraine and the possible scenarios for the near future. The most pressing question, of course, is leading to misunderstanding of why on earth did Russia launch itself into a needless war against Ukraine, which has led to severing the economic and political ties upon which Russia depended for decades. Its exports of oil and gas alone made over 50% of its budget revenues. And the absolute majority of those energy exports actually were going to clients in Europe. But misunderstanding had been almost a constant feature in the Western analysis of Russia. In this case, it was based on, I would say, reverse Orientalism. And Orientalism has been something that was an important element in the Western view of the world. Well, let's project this to Russia. When Europe dealt with Middle Eastern or Far Eastern countries, there were certain preconceptions that affected its view of those nations. In case of Russia, well, they saw the exact opposite. At least since the 18th century, they saw its elite dressed in European fashion and, well, looking European. And therefore, they were perceived as their own, as the nation that would share their values, the way they approached international relations. And very often this was badly mistaken. Even great Winston Churchill once admitted that understanding Russia was a challenge. I'm quoting, "Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma." This kind of approach was more or less constant throughout various stages of Russian development, whether it was the Russian Empire, which I said looked European from the West, but remained a largely Eastern Oriental tyranny by its essence. And then we had the Soviet period, a new communist empire, whose slogans were vastly different from its actual nature. And finally, we had the new Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union, which again was very often badly misunderstood. And the signs of it appeared in the very beginning. And I will quote one of the greatest analysts of international relations, Henry Kissinger, who in the early 90s made this warning when speaking about the need to support the Russia's democratic reforms. And this was the time when the West basically entertained this idea that Russia was transforming into a democratic nation and therefore into a democratic partner of the West. But even then, there were signs that not everything was as proclaimed by the Russian leadership, by President Yeltsin. I'm quoting Kissinger from his great book, Diplomacy, which was published in '94. But Russian reform will be impeded, not helped, by turning a blind eye to the reappearance of historic Russian imperial pretensions, the independence of the new republics, recognized after all by the United Nations, must not be tacitly downgraded by acquiescence in Russian military moves on their soils. Well, this warning actually now sounds painfully important, but like I said, it was ignored. And the irony is that Kissinger is not known to be a kind of idealist. He is the father of Realpolitik. And more idealistic leadership of the West at the time somehow missed the first signs of trouble. And then they did not listen to Russia's leaders themselves when they first confessed that, well, the breakup of the Soviet Union and the new European order was not acceptable. And that even happened before Vladimir Putin came to power. It was Yeltsin himself who, at the end of his presidency, while visiting China, basically threatened the United States with the nuclear weapons when President Clinton criticized its heavy-handed approach to the crisis in Chechnya. Basically, this was not just a crisis, it was a genocide against Chechens, which presumably democratic leadership of Russia committed. And then there were statements by President Putin in 2005 before the Russian parliament, when he said that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. And then he repeated the same thing in face of the Western leaders in Munich, at the Munich Security Conference in 2007. And yet it was ignored. And by that time, there were all signs that Russia was not only challenging the rules-based international system, but was preparing to make practical steps to destroy the European security architecture. And there were further warnings. For instance, Edward Lucas, at the time the editor of the Economist, published a book called The New Cold War. And yet nobody listened. Moreover, he was proclaimed as a warmonger or even ridiculed. So who would listen to us, Georgian diplomats and Georgian politicians, when we did the same and warned about Russia's intentions? Unfortunately, not even after Russian invasion into Georgia in 2008, lessons were learned. The West was determined to turn the page as soon as possible and forget it. Russia's war on Georgia and the occupation of a large part of the country was more or less rewarded by the offers of reset. As you may recall, well, strangely, that reset policy was botched from the outset and even on the symbolic level. When Secretary Clinton offered Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov to symbolically push a button with this inscription reset on it, its Russian translation actually was with an error. And instead of reset in Russian, it said перегрузка, the overload. And this is exactly what we got. Further down the road, there were other very serious signs that Russia was up to no good. For instance, in 2013, they didn't make much of General Valery Gerasimov's letter in a Russian newspaper. And then Gerasimov still is Russia's chief of general staff, when he basically described Russia's goals and methods in conducting a hybrid warfare. When some people actually described this, analyzed this as a new Russian military doctrine, they were again laughed at and ridiculed. But then we saw the actual elements of this hybrid warfare in action in Crimea and Donbass, then in Syria, and then through weaponization of refugees coming from Syria on the one hand, and on the other hand, when it turned out that the most radical anti-immigration political groups in Europe were funded by the Kremlin. They didn't even bother investigating the fact that Brexit campaign in UK was largely financed with the Russian money. So there were many, many signs of trouble which were ignored. And at every stage, the Western decision-making was trying, and this was the priority. First, in the early 90s, there were illusions that Russia was becoming a real ally and a democratic country, and they failed to see the signs that this was just a facade. When Russia started making assertive and then aggressive steps, the approach didn't change much. They preferred to look the other way when Russia was basically returning to imperial kind of style behavior. And they justified this by the need to cooperate with Russia. They justified this with a dependence upon Russian energy supplies in which they found themselves, despite the fact that this is not necessarily how the things should have been. For instance, yes, it is true that Europe had been importing huge amounts of natural gas from Russia, up to 40% at its height. But like I already mentioned, Russia had been even more dependent upon the income from selling energy to Europe. As I said, over 50% of Russia's budget was made up with the money earned from sales of gas and oil to Europe. So how on earth is it possible that Germany and other European countries considered themselves in the state of dependence on Russia and Russian energy, whereas at least they should have been in the state of interdependence? And these questions need to be investigated and answered. And in some cases, I'm afraid, we may find the signs of mismanagement or even corruption. I wouldn't go into further details on this. Now, again, there was another argument that why the West basically sleepwalked into the new Cold War, again, about which we did warn, many of my colleagues too. The argument was, well, Russia is a force to reckon with, and avoiding conflict with Russia was proclaimed a priority by everyone. But here's a problem. Well, unlike tango, conflict doesn't take two willing partners who are willing to coordinate their movements. While the West tried to basically do ice skating with Russia, Russia was engaged in a hockey game with the West. And many in the West simply did not understand why, against all these concessions and gestures of goodwill, Russia was becoming more and more aggressive. And this is where Russia's internal political system, its nature, comes into play, which was, in many cases, misunderstood. But it wasn't necessary, because at all stages of Russian development, Russian-Western relations, there were Western scholars or diplomats who could see through the anatomy of Russian state, its political culture, and its modus operandi. And this starts at a very early stage, and I will give you three most poignant, important examples. Back in the 18th century, the first really clever analysis of why Russia would become a threat to Europe was sent from St. Petersburg by a French diplomat, a French chargé d'affaires in St. Petersburg, Monsieur Laurent Bérenger. And this, and I quote, "If Russian ambition is not checked, its effects may be fatal to the neighboring powers. I know that the degree of Russian power should not be measured by its expanse and that its domination of eastern territories is more an imposing phantom than a source of real strength. But I also suspect that a nation which is accustomed to a servile obedience, which needs little to live and is therefore able to wage war at little cost, such a nation, I suspect, is likely to conquer." And this is 1762. All right, and well, we can go through the history and discover that from then on, Russia conquered Poland, Georgia, and many other countries, right? This applies to the imperial Russia, and how, and what he misses is also the state ideology of the Third Rome, which somehow legitimized Russian conquest in the eyes of Russians. At the second stage of Russian imperial development in the Soviet period, there were again huge illusions, especially during and after the World War II, that, well, the partnership during the war would continue during the building of the New World Order between the United States and the Soviet Union. And again, it took one great thinker and analyst, in this case, George Kennan, to provide in-depth knowledge of the Soviet political system, which made the new conflict between the Soviet Union and the West inevitable. And I'm quoting again, at the bottom of Kremlin's neurotic view of world affairs is traditional and instinctive Russian sense of insecurity. As Russia came into contact with economically advanced West, fear of more competent, more powerful, more highly organized societies in the area. But this latter type of insecurity was on one which afflicted rather Russian rulers than Russian people. For Russian rulers have invariably sensed that their rule was relatively archaic in form, fragile, and artificial in its psychological foundation, unable to stand comparison or contact with political systems of Western countries. For this reason, they have always feared foreign penetration, feared direct contact between Western world and their own, feared that what would happen if Russians learned truth about world without, or if foreigners learned truth about world within. And they have learned to seek security only in patient but deadly struggle for total destruction of rival power, never in compacts or compromises with it. And so on and so forth. So basically, if we turn back to the current situation, why did Mr. Putin declare the West as its main threat, and why it launched himself into this self-destructive war? Well, again, this needs we need to look at Russia's political organization, especially since Mr. Putin came to power. What he has built is, he himself calls a power vertical. It's an autocratic system which gives him and a very few of his cronies a total control over political and economic system of Russia. And after 22 years in power, he has very little to show to his own people in terms of progress, in terms of advancing, improving their quality of life. Russia must be, should be, the world's richest country, and yet it's one of the poorer ones. In 2021, Russia stood at 86th place in GDP per capita, while controlling the world's 40% of natural resources, having educated and talented people. In other words, having everything to be a very rich country, probably the richest. And yet, this poor country is, well, ruled by the world's richest government. Virtually everyone in Russian government are billionaires. So when it comes, well, the natural question that would occur to any Russian citizen would be, why is that after such a long time, we remain poor while the government has become the world's richest people? I mean, these would be very dangerous questions to ask. And this is why Putin decided to return to that old Russian tradition of presenting to their fellow citizens the outside world as hostile, Russia as a besieged fortress. And on top of it, he also decided to promise Russians, instead of better quality of life, to make Russia great again. And this was the final chapter, the assault on Ukraine, regaining this very important part of former Russian Empire, was meant to become the final stage in rebuilding the Russian Empire. Well, it all went wrong from the very outset. And if we ask ourselves where we are going to find ourselves in a few months' time, this is not an easy question, but we are already in a place where very few people would envisage we would have been by this time. There were several huge errors made by Putin and his government. They miscalculated Ukraine's determination to fight in order to defend their freedom. They miscalculated the Western response. By the way, the West should ask themselves why Putin believed so strongly they would do nothing. Maybe it has something to do with the way they reacted to Putin's previous aggression. And as for the future, well, obviously, we cannot see immediate ending to the war. It will end the moment Russia stops its aggression. But we don't see much incentives so far for Putin. Ukraine will continue to fight for its existence because it is now quite clear that Russia is waging a genocidal war. So Ukraine has everything to lose, and therefore there is very little anyone could offer Ukraine in terms of compromise. So as long as the West does not want Putin to succeed in destroying the world's rules-based order, well, it has to continue supporting Ukraine. And the outcome of this war should be to make sure that Russia has no incentive and no capability to continue such behavior in the future. Well, I would be happy to discuss more details in the Q&A, but at this stage, this is where I will finish, and I'll be looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Badridze. It's really important to have a sort of like historic background and overview of the whole situation and the signs that you have mentioned to clearly understand what is happening now and why the things are the way they are. So what were the intentions? So I would like to remind the audience about the Q&A session. So this will be our last part of the webinar. So please make sure to add your questions to the Q&A box. So after this interesting overview of the Russia-Ukraine war, let's continue our discussion on cybersecurity. As you know, the Russia-Ukraine war also is happening in the cyber world. Russia has carried out numerous destructive cyber attacks in Ukraine since the beginning of this year, with targets across the country's energy, media, telecom, and finance industries. So this is kind of new warfare without a classic warrior, and it's far often underestimated. So I would like to go back to our studio, podium studio, with Christine, and she will introduce our next speaker, Mr. Peter Hacker. Over to you, Christine.
Oh, thank you so much, Nutsa, and thank you so much, Georgi, for this very, very interesting insights. Yes, I'm curious to see what are the questions perhaps our participants and guests today may have for this Q&A session. And yes, I'm now very pleased to present our next speaker. Peter Hacker is a passionate, internationally sought after Swiss expert in his field who thinks out of the box. He is a speaker, entrepreneur, and author, and he researches the topics of digital change, cybercrime, cybersecurity, and cyber warfare. He gives keynotes and lectures from New York to Singapore, to Sao Paulo, to Frankfurt, all over the world, describing the challenges, opportunities, and solutions using real examples, not next example, sorry, using real examples to show how drastically influence is for companies and politics. Peter is multilingual and presents in English, French, German, Portuguese, and Spanish. And in his keynote today, he will not only show the development of risk, but also outlines hands-on ways and recommendations to detect and respond to the threats and control the destiny of digital assets. And that's the word enough from me. Peter, join me. The stage is yours. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Christine. Good morning to everyone. It's a true pleasure to be here with you today at this specific session when it comes down to cybersecurity. Let me start with the following words at the end where we are today particularly. Number one, we are at the beginning of the digital era, which means really at the beginning what I say specifically on the cybersecurity world challenges as well. The last 18 months did not have many things in common. There is one particular thing, however, which is in common, which is change. There was only one constant in cybersecurity, particularly in the developments since the invasion of Russia into the Ukraine. That particular development at the end of the day really focuses on the development specifically related to the development of malware. Allow me to take a couple of examples where I'm coming from, particularly in this kind of discussion. And specifically, the discussion is going to be around the aspect of developments, specifically around viruses, malware, and geopolitical change. This particular geopolitical change, I like to say, in the area, particular of cyber warfare. When it looks into the aspect particularly related to the warfare aspects, I like to start with the example of KSAT, the KSAT incident, which was at the beginning of the invasion into Russia. KSAT is a geostationary satellite. The ownership is belonging to a US company called Viasat. When you are entering into the cyberspace, particularly related to an invasion, where you're working hybridly, kinetic warfare, which means physical warfare on the one side, and non-physical warfare, which is non-kinetic cyber operation in a hybrid form, the first thing the Russians tried to hit was the communication center of specifically the Ukraine. And many of these aspects were obviously rolling through the satellite, the KSAT satellite. The KSAT satellite is a satellite which ranges from Central Europe into Turkey at the end of the day, very broad satellite. And to explain such an attack, you have to think about a triangle. And that specific triangle is really built around three things in satellites. Number one, you use a modem in general. From a modem, you bring the traffic up to the satellite. At the satellite bases, we have so-called spot beams, which reflect the data down to the so-called gateways, and from there, specifically into the internet. So what was the major aim of the Russians at that moment in time? The major aim of the Russians was really to kill the communication central. Now, a couple of months later, after the 24th of February, when this particular attack took place, the UK, the European government, and specifically the US were attributing the attack towards the Russian government, which already shows one of the clear challenges we have when it comes down to cyber attacks on the geopolitical aspects. How can you attribute, are you willing to attribute specifically such an attack to a government? What does it mean to the various governments in particular involved? There is one clear message which I would like to leave already at the beginning. Our world today is more vulnerable, is less predictable. And this has two fundamental reasons. Number one, states, cyber criminals, individuals, as well as cybersecurity firms are fighting for supremacy when it comes down to digitalization. Thanks to networks, thanks to software, thanks to applications, thanks to systems, codes, malware, applications, or new weapons. They can be used positively, they can be used negatively, but they can have an impact on geopolitical stability and developments. We are in the middle of a fight on the one side between Moscow, Washington, when it comes down to cybersecurity. But this triangle is really closed by Shenzhen, which means China at the end of the day. And we should always bear this in mind. We are only at the beginning of the development of what I call cybersecurity wars or non-kinetic warfare. In my view, the classical peace war situation is over for quite some time. Many of you might not have recognized this, that we are for ages really in a hidden cyber war. Many of us could not see this, but see it the first time actually now in the conflict between Russia and the Ukraine. Where are we going when we're looking specifically into this direction? How can you react specifically on such an attack? What the Ukraine did very cleverly before the attack on the communication center happened was bringing its digital assets meaning really blockchain assets, into the cloud. They put the assets specifically into the European cloud, where it's being held at the moment, very well spread in the European cloud. Now, this leaves challenges, obviously, from a cybersecurity point of view for other states outside Ukraine, but it was a very clever response. And this particular response was really due to early warnings, early recognitions as well, with support to a certain degree of the NATO, with the support specifically of a response team of the US. Certain assets were taken early before even the invasion took place into specifically Europe at the end of the day. In my view, Ukraine learned a big lesson since 2014, also supported obviously through the NATO support when it comes down to cybersecurity. The implications, if we would look back into 2014 or 2017, on such an attack would be fundamentally different today if they would not have had this particular support. Let's look further forward. What does it really mean when we're looking specifically into cybersecurity? And I like to use here a quote from Marshall McLuhan, the philosopher. He once said, "It is the framework which changes with each technology and not just the picture within the frame. What does it really mean when it comes down to cybersecurity? It really means the following thing. Based also on lessons learned, partially from past conflict, it means the following. Number one, technologies are often used in war conflict circumstances for new developments in digitalization. We are today, as a nation or as a world, at the beginning of the digital age. What does that mean? It means the following. Conflicts, the way we have seen them in the past with the classical warrior type, physical warrior type, to my mind, are partially over. Cyber wars are as disastrous and can be more disastrous than Tomahawk missiles at the end. Why? On the one side, they fly like bullets with supersonic speed. And most important, you can't stop them necessarily immediately at the border. It's not a pandemic, which you can isolate. It's much more. It's a global risk, which any one of us, meaning a state, meaning a corporate, needs to take into account. And hence, we're very well advised to take into account the quote of Marshall McLuhan. In my view, we should always expect the unexpected. Cyber risks today, they are a systemic risk in the way I will show you in a minute. Systemically, not just to a corporation, but to states, to so-called organization, international organization, regional organizations. And we should think beyond the obvious. In other words, not just look at the top down, what we see on the surface related specifically to the iceberg, because yes, these are the visible cyber risks today. What we see below the iceberg is the future. In examples, the past experience when it comes down to cyber attack are very often not predicting the future. We need to look into what technologies are bringing and look into how such technology like artificial intelligence can be used unethically or ethically, either to defend or to attack nations, countries, and ultimately individuals and corporations. Where is the journey going? Well, let's start where the journey already is today. Fundamental differences in cybersecurity and specific attacks between 2017 conflict in the Ukraine and today. Already 2017, Russia was using so-called wiper malware. Wiper malware is nothing else than a malware which has one objective. It's not ransom. It is destruction. It is deletion. Destruction of system, deletion of data. In 2017, some of you might recognize and remember still the attack on NotPetya. NotPetya attack was very much what I call vertical and horizontal distribution. What does that mean? It means nothing else. It was a scattergate approach where a nation-sponsored actor close to the Russian government specifically was attacking de facto the Ukraine, but not specifically targeted to Ukraine. It targeted ultimately anyone in the world. And that wasn't that highly sophisticated malware. What we now see in the attack in the Ukraine currently is very much what I call vertical attacks, highly sophisticated malware targeting individual companies, sector in the Ukraine. To my mind, ladies and gentlemen, that's the future. Nation-sponsored actors, criminal gangs, the future is more and more going to be in the direction of targeting critical infrastructure. Why critical infrastructure? Because processes of critical infrastructure on the one side were separated in the past from the internet, but nowadays the operational technology, which means the processing, the input specifically, is closing more and more together with the internet, which means ultimately potential vulnerabilities towards utilities, towards energy providers, and ultimately more and more attacks, not just in the frequency, but particularly in the severity implications on individual companies and particular states. We are very well advised, whether it's Germany, whether it's any other country at the end of the day, looking carefully about the exposure we currently have in critical infrastructure, and most importantly, how we can mitigate that particular exposure. One thing is very clear when it comes down to a specific nation-sponsored attack. you cannot prevent it. What you can is you can detect it, you can try to minimize it, you can try to mitigate it, but you need to be prepared, which just shows some further examples. And quoting here Lionel Richie, hello again. One of the particular issues at the moment, which many experts see going forward, is obviously a failure of a major cloud. A major cloud, we have 4 or 5 major cloud providers, starting from Amazon, going over to Google, and looking obviously also at the Asian parts at the end of the day. We have cloud providers. These cloud providers today are potentially major targets. If we would have an attack and one of these clouds fails, in my view, we could have some serious implications, not just on states, but on individuals and corporations at the end of the day. What does that mean? Cyber risks today, or cybersecurity in general, is a systemic risk, a potential systemic risk, which can cause a disaster in the same way as a natural disaster can be. It requires that we're thinking outside the box. It requires board support, which means ultimately not just delegation down specifically to the CTO or the cybersecurity CISO, for instance. No, it means direct engagement of the board, crisis management, stress testing, the readiness, not just having a plan, but stress testing it from the beginning to the end, because the attack will come, and then the successors and the failures will depend on how well you're going to be prepared specifically on the situation. In my view today, we only see the tip of the iceberg. Why are we only seeing the tip of the iceberg? Because we're already living today in what I call a sensor industry. If we're looking into a couple of years forward, we will have much more IoT devices, Internet of Things devices. Most of you will already have today fridges, ovens, TVs, which are connected to the internet, which you can obviously steer, which you can well program. They all have, at the end of the day, specific sensors. On average, any IoT device has about 1 dozen to 25 sensors. If you multiply this number with the number of predicted devices we will see in 2025, which is around 75 billion devices specifically related to IoT, you come to a multi-trillion device sensor industry. What does that mean? More data means, on the one side, faster traffic. On the other side, it means faster contact directly to the content you want to see. But most importantly, it also leaves more access points and potential attacking points, which we should always take into account. What we should do, in my view, is first of all, think beyond the obvious. Like you see here specifically on this particular slides. As a pilot, you always need to think to the horizon. And most important, as a pilot, you have a very clear structure how you respond on crisis, how you respond proactively on crisis. And that means this is exactly the way you need to look at cybersecurity and cybersecurity crisis, expecting one and not thinking you won't have ever one at the end of the day. Where is the future going when it comes down to risk? Just 2 examples. I'll see IoT devices being used, some of them obviously being also within critical infrastructure parts for attacks beyond just denial of services, which are nothing else than shutting down ultimately critical infrastructure. It's going beyond that. You could weaponize some of these IoTs. You could work around, temperatures. You could work around thermostats at the end and bringing down nations into crisis when it comes down, particularly to a very strong and harsh winter. The second example, which I like to show, is really more corporate related. Imagine a company bringing up its quarterly reporting, and we use deep fakes. We use fake knowledges. We use fake press conferences or amended data at the end of the day, which could hit the stock of any company at the end. Both of these approaches are very much built around specific artificial intelligence use, I'm not talking about machine learning. I'm really talking about artificial intelligence using really specifically at the end of the day, what I call not just the sensor industry itself, but at the end, really developing codes which are machine learning based, which previously were really tested on a manual basis. But don't get panic, frankly speaking. That's the other point, because very often what I see when it comes to our attack, people panic. If you take into account what we talked around before, thinking beyond the horizon and really stress testing what is relevant to you as far as attacks, as far as defense mechanisms, and where you should report in on a crisis management plan, I strongly believe you don't need to panic. You need to very much take the risk serious, but you need to remain on the front foot. And the only way to remain on the front foot is to be prepared. The same token, let me nearly close with a quote. And some of you probably remember and will be aware of the story of the wolf and the shepherd's boy. I call this "Don't Get Tricked." Now you probably ask yourself, what has the story of the shepherd boy and the wolf to do with IT security? Well, it has to do a lot with IT security, because let's think about the following. In the particular story of the shepherd boy, you have the villagers, which own a lot of sheep. Then you have the boy, the shepherd boy, who obviously protects these sheep, and you have the wolf, the bad guy. Now let's make this bridge to cybersecurity. Now you have the villagers which control the networks, the systems at the end. And you have the boy, which actually is the IT guy at the end. And you have the wolf. And the wolf specifically is obviously the actor, the threat actor. Now in this particular story, the following happened. Like boys sometimes are when they're younger at the end of the day, what they like to do, they like to create attention. So very often the little boy was calling the villagers and say, oh, we have an attack. Well, the wolf is coming. He did this twice. And each time the villagers went out. Nothing was out there. The third time, however, they didn't react. And the boy was killed. Now let's make the bridge to cybersecurity. Many of you potentially sometimes get alarms on systems. Or if you take it to your private life, they have alarms like on a swimming pool. The system is not at the right level. It beeps, beeps, beeps. First time you react, second time react, third time you don't react. And the quintessence out of this is take things serious, but be in the position to triage, which means differentiate what is relevant to you and what is not relevant to you. From my point of view, you shouldn't blame here the boy. You should really blame at the end of the day the villagers, because cybersecurity is a consistent investment on the one side at board level, which means in conclusion the following. 4 concluding points. Number 1, rest assured, our future remains unpredictable, more volatile. This has 4 key reasons. Number 1, thanks to networks, thanks to systems, thanks to data, and thanks to data software, intruders, states, cybersecurity companies can use these components to drive power, to shift power, but also to respond positively. From a company's point of view, we need to focus on crisis management, proactively expect an attack, thinking about if we have such an attack, who we take to the table, bring forensicers into place, but stress test them, and ultimately try to transfer risk to the external parties. Which means, in my view, we are living, ladies and gentlemen, in a known, unknown world. And we better look out for the future than rather think back into the past. Cybersecurity, digital trust, which means trust in your data, trust in your system, trust in your people, go hand in hand potentially with power shift on the geopolitical station area, meaning military shift, political shift, and economic shift. In conclusion, cybersecurity has never been as important as today. We are only at the beginning of the development. I would like to say thank you very much for today's opportunity to talk to you, and I look forward to receiving any kind of question you may have from your side. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hacker, for all the insights and tips. I'm sure that's really helpful for our audience. I see that a lot of questions are coming from the audience. So let's get started with the Q&A section of our webinar. And I want to give the floor to Mr. Badridze, and the first question will be to him. So what do you think is the future for Mr. Putin and his regime? Any vision where the Russia is headed?
Well, this is a very important question and a very hard one to answer. On the one hand, Putin has undermined the regime, which seemed to be extremely stable. Like I mentioned, there was no real reason why he launched himself into the war, which basically deprived Russia of its most stable source of income. It is finding itself in isolation, which even the Soviet Union never experienced at the height of the Cold War. The prospects are very bleak. And personally for Putin, what he has done, he has increased the stakes so much that now he left himself very little room for retreating without destroying his own authority. So instead of consolidating and extending his power as he aimed initially, he basically now has questioned his own future. And this is one of the sources of fears internationally, that he might resort on using the tactical nuclear weapons. However, he has been very clearly and directly told that the use of nukes would result in a catastrophic kind of consequences to Russia and personally to him. And it's not coming just from the United States, but also from China, which has very openly and directly basically rebuked Russia for the war, and especially for the threat of nuclear war. So, well, I can quite see Putin staying in power for long. There are interesting features about Russia which are not usual for other European or other nations. I already have quoted, Russians have very unique ability to weather all sorts of hardships. Sanctions are not necessarily going to bring Putin down. But on the other hand, while Russians can often live through economic difficulties and through tyranny, what they do not like is the tyrants who lose wars. So I would not be surprised if we witness some kind of regime change in the future. This doesn't mean that day after tomorrow we will see more liberal, more democratic new government in Russia. But Putin personally, well, there is very little future for him.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mr. Badridze. And I would like to go to Mr. Hacker with the next question. So what should financial institutions, corporations, and governments be looking for to ensure that they don't fall into cybercrime traps? And what would be the obvious signs to look out for? And what can be the sort of like techniques to prevent them?
Thank you very much for this rather broad question. Specifically, I think we should start with that financial institutions are one of the top 4 to 5 industries being targeted on a global basis. I think the way it has to start when you look at financial institutions, you have to look at that financial institutions are normally target multifolded. So I give you a classical example based on my own experience. Intruders in financial institutions normally target data. They target either data extraction or they target specific an interruption of processes, specifically, which can lead into what I call an interruption of a company. So what financial institutions should really focus on, that they can recognize there is an attacking surface, which is normally their network and their data, but these attacks are happening multifolded. So to make an analogy, it's pretty much like if you are driving on a highway, and then on that particular highway, you have to pay a toll tax. If you don't pay this toll tax, then obviously what normally happens, you get a queue. And that's, the analogy is really what I call there, specifically distributed denial of service attack, which means it brings down your system or it blocks the system to a certain degree, and people focus only on this particular attacking vector, forgetting at the same token that they might be attacked or will be attacked simultaneously on a data extortion basis, which means people in the first step, they get access to your system. They withdrew specifically data from your system, and they will ask for a ransom. And financial institutions are definitely currently very much targeted on ransomware attacks, particularly in 2020, early 2021. They were one of the prime victims of ransomware attacks. I predict going forward that this level will increase again. What can they do against it? In my view, number one is really top-down stress test their readiness, which means direct reporting of the crisis management team, CISL team, into the board, either be positioned in the board or having a sponsored. And then any kind of incident response needs to be ultimately stress tested face-to-face with red teaming exercises, blue teaming exercises. What kind of IT security could you use or defense mechanism you could use? It really starts with the understanding that you will become the victim of a cyber attack sooner or later. Meaning you have to have access to data allowing you to really see how attacks are happening, detect these attacks, monitor these attacks, and response. There are many ways, many IT mechanisms you could use. And if somebody would be interested in detail, I'm more than happy to respond separately, because that would be quite a technical response.
Thank you, Mr. Hecker. I'm sure this is a broad topic, and this could be like a whole different topic for the another separate discussion. Next question would be for Ambassador Badridze. So we have seen the sort of persistent battle from the Ukraine side, and how do you see politically? Is the country divided, or you see the nation is united with its fight for the independence?
I suspect that many of my Ukrainian friends are not going to like my answer, but when they, after the victory and when peace comes to Ukraine, when they will be building the monuments of founding fathers of the Ukrainian nations and the state which has come to some kind of consensus about itself, its identity, somewhere at that monument, there should be a reference to Putin. I can't think of many other historical figures who have contributed to consolidating this nation as much as Putin's genocidal war on Ukraine has done for this. Before the war, especially before 2014, but especially before this war, there were all sorts of political, cultural, other divisions. Today, even the Russian-speaking Ukrainians are convinced that first and foremost, they are Ukrainians and that they need to fight for their own country, for their nation, against the Russian invasion. Like I said, never in history before this nation has been so united and so determined to persevere, and this is what they will do. Internal political divisions within the major political forces have also been put aside. Ukraine is united as never before.
Thank you, Mr. Badridze. And then with the last question, I want to go back to Mr. Hacker. So will the Russia-Ukraine war reshape the internet and cyberspace, and how?
Definitely it will. I think definitely it will. What we now recognize is really three things. Number one, in my view, this constant time of peace and war is over from a cybersecurity point of view. For the first time, people really recognize that we have been living for quite some time already in a hidden cyber war. The way it's going to reshape, in my view, as a prediction is the following one. At the moment, you see a lot of threat actors and individual hacktivists really focusing on this particular conflict, which means on the one side, on the Russian side, on the other side, on the Ukraine side. Image-wise, I would describe it a little bit like flood and tide, you know. You have a flood and you have a tide. Many of the activists are now currently what I call like, you know, in the tide, going out into the water, you know, surfacing by all means, being committed to this conflict. What I could recognize, once the war is open, the tide is coming in, and we better prepared on a global basis what that means. In my view, it means the following one: getting back to a lot of the ransomware attacks we have seen state-sponsored, particularly on critical infrastructure on a global basis. And ultimately, it's a fight for supremacy, you know? Thanks to networks, thanks to applications, data, and systems, any of these actors can today shift the world going forward. I give you a classical example. Even some very poor nations, economically, like North Korea, have some very powerful cyber developments. When it comes down to Russia, I do strongly still believe there's they have something in the back when it comes to cybersecurity. We could see a further development of that particular war on cybersecurity, but definitely the conclusion is we're only at the beginning of attacks on a global basis, and we better prepared, we better take this serious and look out. That's my prediction.
Thank you, Mr. Hacker. We have remaining questions, but unfortunately we need to be just cautious of the time limit. And then I want to say huge thank you on behalf of PODIUM and the Brain Sites to our speakers, to Mr. Hacker and Ambassador Badridze for delivering such an amazing session. And also huge thank you to our audience for the time and participation in our webinar. We are really pleased to see such interesting questions coming from you. We want to let you know that recording of this webinar will be available, and we will send this to you to your registered emails. Make sure to check out our social platforms to learn more about our next collaboration with PODIUM and different exciting events and news we have coming for you. I want to go back to Christine, if you want to say a couple of words before we close our session.
Yes, thank you so much, Nizar, for giving me the last word for today. And thank you very much again to you, Mr. Badridze, and to you, Peter, for this fantastic keynotes, very, very deep insights we got from you today. We are happy that you have joined us. And yes, I look forward to our next international talk together with Zebra Insights, and stay healthy, and we will be happy when you will join us again. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.